The Seventh Saga is an RPG made by Prodeus and published by Enix in 1993. Now, if you have heard of this game at all, it's probably because of its reputation for being the quote-unquote hardest RPG on the Super Nintendo. The reason for this reputation stems from the fact that they significantly increased the difficulty for the US version of the game. The Japanese original, called Elnard, is actually much easier, and I'll go into those changes a little more later on when I talk about the gameplay. There seems to be different views online on whether or not the difficulty change was intentional or accidental. Either way, the Western marketing teams seem to be acutely aware of it. They even mention it on the back of the box. Actually, let me read this text out loud in a dramatic fashion for a minute, because it has to be heard to be believed. This is not your ordinary RPG. The graphics are eye-popping, breathtaking, stunning, and unbelievable. Not to mention incredible. This is no hack and slash rip your guts out fighter. This is the future of RPGs, right here in your hands. With music this good, you won't turn the sound off, you'll turn it up. No more small elves leading your team. This game contains real, believable figures. You won't be embarrassed to use your own name, you'll be proud. It's just you against 6 other characters in search of the 7 sacred runes. Whoever finds them rules the world. It's that simple, that easy. The only problem is, you have some enemies. And I don't mean a few. I mean an army of things you've never seen before, ready to raise the hair on the back of your neck and take you out with one swing. This is one powerful RPG. Can you handle it? Video game marketing in the 90s was fucking wild. I almost expected John Romero to pop up and call me his bitch at the end there. As toxic and condescending as this text is though, they're not wrong. There are a lot of enemies, and some of them just might take you out in one swing as well. Now, there is a patch out there that restores the original Japanese difficulty to the game. But for this video, I decided to go with the US version for a couple of reasons. 1. I'm a real gamer girl. 2. It's the version most viewers will probably be familiar with. And 3. The difficulty is kinda what makes a lot of people interested in this game in the first place. Now, for me personally, I have always been fascinated with the Seventh Saga. Not just because of its proposed challenge, but also because of its general vibes. I tried beating the game a couple of times, but never found the patience to finish it. This time though, with the goal of wanting to make this video, I actually sat down and beat the whole thing. And doing so answered a lot of questions for me that I always had about it. Like, is the game really that difficult? What does difficulty even mean in the context of an RPG, where you can often just level grind your way to victory? And most importantly, is this game actually worth playing? The answers that I found are, of course, subjective, but I want to share them with you regardless. So let me take your hand and guide you into another world, the world of the Seventh Saga. The game takes place on a distant planet called Tikondera. It's a fairly archaic fantasy setting, sprinkled with a few sci-fi elements, like robots and the occasional futuristic vehicle. Hell, you can even play as a robot. The intro shows a cast of 7 different characters being recruited by a guy called King Lemuel. Lemuel is basically the ruler of the entire world, but he's getting on in years and is looking for a successor. He trains his 7 apprentices for 5 years, before tasking them with going out into the world and collecting the 7 sacred runes, which grant great power to whoever wields them. The apprentice who returns with all of the runes will become the new ruler in King Lemuel's stead. And that's basically the story for about 80% of the entire game. The king hands each apprentice a crystal ball, which pretty much acts like a radar, to help them find the runes, and sends them off on their quest. You, the player, pick your apprentice, give them a name, and venture out on your epic quest for global leadership. The apprentices all have different strengths and weaknesses, but not all of them map exactly to a specific archetype. You got Camille the Knight and Olwen the Dwarf, who are more physically oriented characters, but still learn some useful magic. They both rely heavily on equipment upgrades. Camille is a bit of an all-rounder, while Olwen is more focused on defense and attack power. Isuna the Elf, Valsu the Priest, and Ligis the Demon are the more magically focused characters, with Valsu being the best healer, Ligis having most of the offensive magic, and Isuna being a bit of a mix of both. Wilmy the Alien and Lux the Tetujin, which basically translates to robot, are a little different. They have very little magic and are really strong, but don't really get much in terms of equipment. While there are characters that are probably better than others, you can pretty much choose whoever tickles your fancy and still beat the game just fine. I picked Camille the Knight because he seemed like the most basic character, and, well, I'm a basic bitch. One thing that immediately stands out about the 7th Saga are the visuals. The box text already mentioned the more realistically proportioned character sprites, which do a good job of differentiating the game visually from its more anime-inspired contemporaries. While the towns and villages in the game look rather bland, and even kinda ugly sometimes, there is a desolate beauty to be found in the game's overworld and dungeons. These dangerous places sport a more muted color palette, with lots of browns, greys, and dark greens. There's a certain post-apocalyptic vibe to the world of Tikondera. Settlements and dungeons are separated by vast stretches of wasteland, with only the occasional spot of green to be found. There really is something hauntingly beautiful about these big, empty environments that really enticed me to explore this world and uncover its secrets. The real eye candy lies in the battle screens though, which is good, since you'll be spending a lot of time there. Enemies and allies alike have huge battle sprites, all with their own unique attack animations. Because the battle sprites are so big and so close to the camera, combat feels quite intimate and intense as a result. Watching your characters swing their weapons and reduce an enemy HP bar to 0 never fails to feel viscerally satisfying. Special mention should also go to the enemy designs. Some of the creatures you have to face are downright terrifying and grotesque looking, which, coupled with the high difficulty, makes them even more intimidating. Seriously, some of these things look like they're straight out of Berserk or something. I kind of just wanted to keep playing to see what new feats the game would throw at me in the next area. The soundtrack is pretty nice too. I mean, you've been hearing it throughout this video. The music in town sounds cheerful and laid back. Traversing the desolate overworld is accompanied by appropriately somber tunes. And the combat music is surprisingly varied, with multiple battle themes, none of which got on my nerves. Which is good, because you'll be hearing them a lot. So with that being said, let's finally talk about the combat. Combat in this game is equal parts exciting and frustrating, which sure is a bit of a trade-off. But I take this emotional roller coaster any day over a game like, say, Breath of Fire, where every single encounter just bores me to death with how inconsequential it is. In the 7th Saga, you have to treat almost every encounter like a mini-boss. Enemies hit incredibly hard, but so do you, so fights are quick and deadly and rarely outstay their welcome. You can only have a maximum of 2 party members, so every decision you make as a player is vital. I also really like how buffs and protective spells are actually really important in this game, because in a lot of RPGs around this era, support spells are often not worth using, and that's definitely not the case here. The game also has this really neat mechanic where if you use the defend command, you get a significant damage multiplier to your next attack, which leads to this fun combat rhythm where you keep alternating between defending and attacking while still trying to survive. Offensive magic is also really useful for most of the game, but its efficiency really falls off during the endgame, where buffs and physical attacks are much more effective. Enemies in the 7th Saga are tricky bastards. There are no unique enemy abilities. Instead, all of the monsters pull from the same pool of spells that the player characters do, so everything you can do, an enemy might be able to do as well. They can steal your precious MP, they can buff themselves, heal themselves, and even revive each other sometimes, which is particularly aggravating. The most annoying thing about combat by far though is your hit chance. Enemies can dodge your attacks. Hell, they can even dodge your spells, and they will do so annoyingly often. Thankfully, the same goes for you too. There's nothing more infuriating than spending 2 rounds buffing, defending, then whiffing your attack on the 3rd round. But there's also nothing more exhilarating than dodging an enemy's attack and retaliating immediately after. The issue with enemies dodging your attacks is tied directly to the main difference between the 7th Saga and the original Elnard. That being that they nerfed your character's stat gains while porting the game to the Super Nintendo. So, if you find yourself missing a lot, it's because your character's speed stat is much lower than it actually should be. If you find yourself having a hard time hitting the enemies in the area that you're currently in, that's always a good sign that you're too low level and should put in another grinding session. I did a lot of grinding in this game, but I never really felt over-leveled. One thing that makes the lethality of combat more bearable is that the penalty for dying is pretty minor. You simply lose half your money and respawn at the last inn you rested at. Getting back to where you were before is usually fairly quick too, and dungeons are not that big. So the game can be hard, but it's actually pretty forgiving at the same time. The 7th Saga boasts a couple of interesting features that differentiate it from other RPGs. First off, there's the crystal ball you get from King Lemuel in the beginning of the game. When you're on the world map or in a dungeon, this crystal ball is always prominently displayed in the upper left corner of the screen and basically functions like a radar. Towns and dungeons you can enter are represented by a circle. If that circle is flashing red, it means that one of the 7 runes can be found at that location. All of the little white dots represent enemy encounters. In most RPGs, random encounters occur after taking a semi-random number of steps, so as long as you're standing still, you're safe. But in the 7th Saga, encounters actively hunt you down. You can still open the menu to pause the game, but as long as you're moving around, you are always on the run, which adds a real sense of thrill and urgency to exploration. You can even use the radar to outmaneuver and outrun enemies sometimes, which feels awesome, but it's pretty hard to do, especially inside of tight dungeon corridors. So you will always get caught eventually. The most unique feature of the 7th Saga is the apprentice system. The other 6 apprentices you didn't choose as the protagonist in the beginning function as both your rivals and potential allies for the rest of the game. You will periodically encounter the other apprentices in the game's many towns. When you talk to them, they might chat with you, they might offer to join your party, or they might just outright attack you. You can partner up with one apprentice at a time, but you can always ditch them later for someone else. Your partner might even betray and attack you when you claim one of the runes, although thankfully the chances of that happening are pretty low. It's a surprisingly intricate system for such an old game. The fact that you never really know which apprentice is gonna show up where, and how they will react to you, makes these interactions feel pretty organic. As someone who enjoys playing around with RPG Maker, and who someday would like to make an RPG herself, I tend to look at these older RPGs not just with the lens of a player, but also from a designer's perspective. One aspect that always fascinated me about JRPGs is the design of the world map, which has almost become something of a lost art form. A good world map is more than just a means of connecting the different towns and dungeons to another. The best RPGs of the era managed to make their game worlds feel like a huge exploration puzzle, with new areas opening up when the player unlocks vehicles or key items, almost like a Metroidvania. The layout of the 7th Saga's world map is comparatively pretty simple, but still effective for what the game is trying to do. The vast majority of the game world is dominated by one giant continent, and while there technically are vehicles, their use is confined to fixed cutscenes in which the player is transported from one location to the next, and can't be used for free exploration. So you will have to traverse the entirety of Tikondera by foot. Progression is initially very linear. You go from area to area, visiting dungeons along the path, and searching for the runes. Towns and dungeons are connected by vast stretches of empty land, so going from one place to another often feels like a death race because of how the game handles its random encounters, with the player frantically looking at the crystal ball for a circle donating the next safe haven. Once you reach the northern part of the continent, the game opens up in a really enjoyable way. This area is basically designed like a big circle around a central mountain range. There are multiple runes to find here, and the order in which you collect them is pretty much up to you, with only the enemy power level stopping you from venturing in a certain direction. The game stops holding your hand here. It's really fun to just stumble into a random dungeon with no idea how it connects to your quest, getting your butt kicked and deciding to come back later when you're stronger. Getting to this part of the game is also one of the few moments where who you choose as your main character actually has an impact on the game's progression. Depending on which apprentice is your leader, you get to the northern part of the continent by different means and arrive at a different part. With Camille, for example, I took a submarine trip through an underground lake that connected the two halves of the continent together. But if I had been playing as Isuna the elf, or Lux the robot, I would have traveled there by ship and would have ended up on the western coast instead of the eastern shore. Alvin the dwarf gets access to a tower here that houses a teleporter, bringing him all the way to the northern peak of the map. After this section, the game becomes linear again, which is fine, because leaving the eastern continent for the smaller, snowy continent in the west means entering the final stretch of the game, where the story actually starts to pick up a bit. Up until this point, the game's story consists mostly of little episodic vignettes. For example, early on you will have to pass through a place called the Gate of Earth in order to progress. But the gate is locked, and the key can be found in the haunted castle of Iran, guarded by a monstrous creature called Romus. After going to Iran and getting completely destroyed by Romus, an old lady in a nearby town tells us the tragic backstory of this boss monster. A while ago, a traveler came into town who had a shiny stone. The king of Aran desired the stone and murdered the traveler over it. Romus was the traveler's dog, who grieved by his master's corpse until he too perished, and his ghost has been haunting Castle Aran ever since. After telling you this story, the woman's husband gives you a whistle, a keepsake from the traveler, which you can then use to pacify Romus and put his soul to rest. There are a few stories in the game that follow this formula. There's a boss who has a rune or another key item you need, so you have to go out and kill them. But oh no! It turns out they have a tragic backstory. For the most part, the writing and presentation of these quests is way too bland to elicit much of an emotional response. But there's one story that genuinely got to me. There's a town later on in the game where all of the children have been kidnapped. Talking to the townspeople reveals that they were taken by a sorceress who had lost her own child and went mad with grief. The sorceress lives in a nearby castle, so naturally, you go there to free the children. Talking with the sorceress reveals that she has become so delusional that she accuses you of being the ones who took her child away from her, and she starts attacking you. After killing her in self-defense, you go into the next room where all the children are, and they're all like, "Hey, we had a lot of fun. Where's the kind lady that took us here?" And even later, back in the town, they're like, "Wow, that was so fun at the castle. I really want to go there again." So, I mean, of course it was wrong of the sorceress to kidnap the children, but she was obviously mad with grief and didn't mean any harm, and treated the kids really well. And the game does a pretty good job of making you feel like shit for having just killed her. It's great. Alright, let's talk about the rest of the story though. Be warned. Spoilers for the story and ending of the 7th saga will follow. Although, if you're asking me, this isn't the game you play for its story anyway, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But there are a couple of cool reveals, so if you wanna go in blind, you should probably skip to here. Once you've gotten 6 of the 7 runes, the game has you take a plane ride to the frozen continent to the west, where presumably the last rune can be found. The plane crashes and you're taken in by the residents of a nearby village. People here seem to be on edge, because an ancient evil seems to be stirring and causing the unnaturally cold weather in the area. The resident prophet wishes to speak to you. He tells you how King Lemuel defeated the demon Gariso 100 years ago, but now it seems like Gariso is back. You, being an apprentice of King Lemuel, are tasked to go to Gorfon Castle and put an end to Gariso once and for all. Pretty basic stuff, but it's nice to finally have a more noble goal than just get all the runes and become the ruler of the world. So you get to Gorfon Castle and beat Garisa, who is pretty easy after all the things you've done before, and he's even kind enough to drop the wizard rune upon his death. So that's convenient. Now we've got all 7 runes. What follows next is the big plot twist of the game. King Lemuel himself appears before you and destroys all of the runes you collected. He reveals that he's not actually Lemuel, but named Gorja. He came from the past, killed the real Lemuel 5 years ago, and tasked you with finding the runes, because they contain his sealed away power. His plan now fulfilled, he sends you back into the past 5,000 years ago. It turns out that back then 2 divine powers were locked in combat. Gorja, who's basically Satan, and Zaro, who's basically Jesus. This is the point of no return in the story, by the way. If you're not sufficiently leveled up, let's say at least level 40, by the time you get here, you are fucked. So you go to help out Zaro in his battle against Gorja, because you got nothing better to do, but you find him dying in a cave. With his last breath, he removes Gorja's curse on the runes and tells you to go kill him. Zaro's followers give you the runes, but they work differently here in the past. So you go into Gorfon Castle again and face Gorja, the final boss. Sadly, there's no special final boss music. You have to use the runes in a specific order in order to beat Gorja, but with his last remaining power, Gorja actually kills you and flees into the future. The ending reveals that you are then reincarnated in the future as King Lemuel. So basically, the story is one giant time loop. First, Lemuel gets killed and replaced by Gorja. Then Gorja sends you out to find the runes that sealed his power. You do that and get sent into the past by Gorja. You use the runes in the past to seal Gorja's power. You get killed and reincarnated in the future as Lemuel. Gorja kills and replaces you and sends your original self to fetch the runes, and so on and so forth. Basically, you're locked into a perpetual millennia-spanning cycle where you are killed and reborn over and over again, fighting a never-ending battle of good versus evil. What a cool fucking concept. But sadly, the execution is kind of underwhelming, because, again, the writing is pretty dull, and there aren't really any compelling characters or big emotional moments to latch onto. Still, I'm a sucker for time loop stories, so I definitely got a kick out of this one. It's finally time to talk about the elephant in the room. Is the game really as hard as people are saying it is? And the answer is, it depends on what you define as difficult. Obviously, this being a turn-based RPG, you don't need any fast reflexes. You don't have to learn to read intricate enemy patterns or perform any pixel-perfect maneuvers. The game doesn't ask you to employ any crazy complex strategies either. Sure, as I said before in the combat section, making the right decision at the right time is important, but your pool of options at any given time is very manageable, and eventually you settle into a routine of setting up your buffs, defending, attacking, using the occasional offensive spell, and healing when necessary. There are bosses that shake up the formula a bit, and you have to always pay attention to what's going on, but it's not a huge brain teaser either. However, the game has a lot of nasty difficulty spikes that can really catch you off guard, and it just doesn't play fair sometimes. I've already talked about the fact that your stat gains from level ups are lowered from the Japanese version. What I didn't mention is that this only applies to your character and the apprentice currently in your party. All of the other apprentices quietly level up alongside you, and they benefit from the better Elnard stat gains. This can make fighting them very hard and even borderline impossible at times, especially if you level too much in the beginning, because there is one point fairly early in the game where you will have to fight an apprentice, and it's likely the hardest fight in the game for this reason. There's also the point of no return I mentioned in the spoiler section that can really screw you over if you get there too early. Apart from these two instances though, the game is very manageable. The main two skills you will need in order to finish the 7th saga are patience and persistence. You need patience for all of the grinding you will have to do in order to even stand a chance at survival. Although, using an emulator with a fast forward function really helps with that. And persistence, to throw yourself at a dungeon or an enemy over and over again, getting a little farther each time until you finally overcome the challenge. If that sounds rewarding to you, then you should give the 7th Saga a shot. This game is much closer in spirit to 8-bit RPGs like Final Fantasy I or the original Phantasy Star than it is to its contemporaries on the Super Nintendo. It's a game that's more about the journey and exploring a strange and hostile world than it is about memorable characters and story moments. If you enjoy this old style of RPG, if you want a game where combat is more than just an afterthought, if you want something different than the usual anime aesthetic, or if you just want to be a big stompy robot who shoots laser beams at dragons, this game might be for you. I had a lot of fun with it, much more than I initially thought I would have. So don't let this game's reputation scare you away from trying it out. Who knows? You might discover a new favorite. Alright everyone, this is the end of the video. If you've come this far, thank you very much for watching. I'm just gonna take this opportunity and go a little off script to talk about some points about the game that I think are worth talking about, but I couldn't really find a way to fit them in the script organically, so I'm just gonna slap them on at the end. There will be spoilers here again, so if you want to play the game for yourself and go in completely blind, I guess you can click off the video now. The first thing I want to talk about that I really like about this game is the runes that you collect are actually really useful in gameplay. Like in a lot of these older RPGs, you collect these MacGuffins like the crystals in the early Final Fantasy games and stuff like that, and they usually just clutter up your inventory and are only there for plot reasons. But in the 7th Saga, the runes actually have very powerful effects. Like very early on you get the wind rune, which lets you teleport to every town that you've visited before. You get other runes that can heal your MP or HP or buff you when you use them in combat, and they're incredibly useful. So you begin incorporating them in your basic combat routine. Because items are very limited. You can only have like 9 types of each item. So having like these reusable items that mimic like powerful spells in combat is incredibly good. But that makes it all the more impactful when you get to that one point in the story where all your runes are taken away. So it's not just impactful in a story sense, but also in a gameplay sense, because you feel much, much weaker afterwards, because these powerful artifacts that you relied on all this game are suddenly gone. And it's kind of great how the gameplay mimics the low point in the story here by making you really feel a lot weaker. I think that's a really cool moment. There's a specific type of dungeon called a castle dungeon, like I talked about Castle Aran, or the castle with the evil sorceress. And one thing that's pretty neat about these dungeons is they all have like a fixed boss encounter. And once you've beaten that boss, the random encounters in the area completely stop, and the music changes and becomes much more cheerful, which is really cool. So one thing you can do in these dungeons is, instead of doing the usual thing where you like walk around, collect the treasure, is that you instead try to make a beeline for the boss and defeat them. And then you can just have a nice relaxing time going through the entire dungeon, which is now peaceful, and collect all the treasure. And I thought it was a really cool feature. There is this recurring enemy called Poison, which is a bounty hunter that gets sent to kill you. And you fight him as a recurring boss and multiple times in the game. First off, you kill him. Then he comes back as Red Poison. He basically comes back from the underworld just to kill you. And then in the final part of the game, you go through this cave and you discover like this gravestone with your name engraved on it. And then just a few steps further, you uncover Poison again, who is now Metal Poison, and fights you for a final time. And I just love this, because this guy is such a drama queen that he like carries a whole ass gravestone through this dungeon just to place it there, just to make a dramatic entrance before you fight him. I thought it was really funny. What else is there? Another gameplay mechanic that kinda sucks is there are hidden items in this game that don't show up at all, but you can basically press like the interact button on the overworld to search an inconspicuous tile and maybe find an item. And it's really annoying. The 7th Saga actually has a sequel on the Super Famicom that never came out in the West. It's called Mystic Arc, and it's a very interesting game. It's a lot more surreal than the 7th Saga. It's less generic fantasy. It's also a lot more easy and approachable. And I really want to cover this game at some point. I'm not sure if that's gonna be my next video, but if you liked this one, that's something you can maybe look forward to. So yeah, that's everything. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe if you want to see more content from me. And leave a like and a comment. And I see you next time. Goodbye.